So my name is Chloe Secreti, and yeah, I did the data analytics track. And so for my project, I wanted to focus on my experience in healthcare. And so I am a current speech language pathologist. I work in rehabilitation and also in acute care in hospitals. And I'm in the informatics master's program. And so I wanted to kind of focus in on patient populations that I had the most questions about and ended up landing on patients that have had very extended hospitalizations. So often these patients were on the surface healthy before their hospitalization and then, got into the hospital, had a lot of things go wrong and then have pretty lifelong illnesses after that and also huge hospital bills. So I wanted to see if there was demographic information, if there was diagnoses, and also if there was some, rhyme or reason to hospital costs. So those were kind of my questions, and I start with definition. Um, so I found that research said that 21 days and longer are considered extended or prolonged hospitalizations. And the quote unquote average hospitalization or hospital stay is 4.6. So I use between 4 and 5 days for that as my variables. This is my data. This is from the New York Department of Health. I used a convenient sample of 10,000 entries for each consecutive year over the course of 2 years. And so you see here, this first few columns are demographic information. We have length of stay. And then we have charges and costs. So I calculated a new column to the far right. That is the charge to cost ratio as a way to kind of consider the length of stay and, the costs of extended hospitalizations while still, trying to control for it. And then for the diagnoses. So obviously all of this I used Python pandas. And I did have to edit a few things. So for example, the diagnoses, I did filter out psychiatric diagnoses because they're just very different in nature and often extended, but kind of the subject of another
Hello.
analysis.
Hi, you've reached the computer support.
Okay. And so with this data, I created a Tableau dashboard. So with my dashboard, I had the variable here. So the length of stay, you can change. So this is representative of the average. So this is between 4 and 5 days. And this is the extended. So 21 to 117 was my max for the data. So for each graph, I did these are the most common diagnoses. And if you look up here on the diagnosis group, COVID and sepsis were the most common, and it was also true of the average. So I wanted to see if sepsis and COVID had a higher proportion in the extended stay compared to the average, which they did. The demographic information on the pie charts is pretty self-explanatory. And then the bottom right-hand graph is the charge to cost ratio. So if you see there's a pretty significant variance and it's much higher and prolonged compared to the average up here, which is under 2. So with that, I'll move on to the results. So I did find significant demographic differences. So in prolonged hospitalization, there were much higher percentage male, ages 50 to 69, Spanish, other race, Black, African American were all higher in percentage. Obviously, we saw that the charge to cost ratio showed significant variance, but also the ratio itself was much higher compared to the average. The diagnosis is maybe the most significant part of my results. So the higher proportions of sepsis and COVID compared to the average, but also the diagnoses such as respiratory failure, stroke, UTI, those are more acute conditions, and I found those were higher in the prolonged hospitalization compared to the average had more chronic conditions, which would be down here like the COPD, the osteoarthritis, and congestive heart failure. So I know I'm coming up on time. So really quickly, I would just say next steps would be repetition with the larger sample size, considering past medical history, looking at secondary, tertiary diagnoses to see how that comes into play. More statistical analysis to find significance between age group and diagnosis. And then I think, considering all of these things, if it was extensively studied, I think, it could result in a review of standard billing practices and maybe even protocols for prevention. So that is me. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the breakout room.